The Korean Mafia boss chose his mistress after I loved him for 3 years. When I walked out, his entire empire followed me. My husband brought his mistress to the Winter Council dinner and seated her 12 feet from where I sat as his wife. He thought I would stay silent. He had always thought that. What Junho never knew, what none of the 12 most dangerous men in Seoul knew as they sat around that table, was that every building they met in, every contract their empire stood on, every foundation their power had ever rested on, was signed with my father's name underneath his. He invited me to a dinner built on my inheritance and forgot to invite me to the truth. That was the last mistake he made as my husband. The Grand Elysian Hotel's private dining room cost $40,000 to reserve for one evening. I know because Junho's assistant had mentioned it to me the week before in the specific way that people mention expensive things to women they believe should feel fortunate, carefully with a pause after to let the number land. The room was worth every dollar of it. 12 courses, hand-painted porcelain, candles replaced on the hour. But it was not the money that made the room what it was. It was the silence. When Seo Junho entered a room, something happened to the air. Not the dramatic silence of a man making an entrance. Something more precise than that. Conversations did not stop. They reorganized themselves, lowered their volume, found safer subjects. Assistants straightened their posture without being told to. Even the staff moved differently, with the specific economy of people who understood that every unnecessary movement near this man was a risk they had calculated and chosen to avoid. His 2 bodyguards took positions outside the dining room doors without being asked. They had done this for 7 years. They would do it without instruction until the day they stopped working for him. I had watched this happen at every public event since the day I married him. The room reshaping itself around his presence, like water around something heavy dropped into it. I had once found it magnetic. Now I sat at the far end of the table and watched it happen one last time. Ha-eun arrived at 9:47. She wore midnight green, understated, deliberate, the kind of entrance that announces nothing because it does not need to. She was brought through the side door by Junho's personal assistant, the same assistant who had told me about the $40,000 room, and seated at a smaller table near the wall I had been told was reserved for overflow guests. The staff treated her like someone important. She knew Junho's drink order. I watched the way she held herself, not like a guest, not like overflow, like a woman who had been to this room before and understood exactly how much space she was permitted to occupy. Junho did not turn his head, but his left hand, resting flat on the table beside his wine glass, moved, just slightly, just enough. I had spent 3 years studying that hand, the way it stilled when he was deciding something, the way it opened when he was satisfied, the way it moved, that particular small movement, when something near him had his complete attention without his face giving it away. I looked down at my plate and understood everything. If you have ever sat across a table from the person who chose someone else and understood it in a single moment, not screamed, not confronted, just understood, drop your city or your country in the comments right now. Because what I did next was not what anyone in that room expected from me, and it was the beginning of everything. I did not make a scene. That was the first decision. Quiet, immediate, mine. I finished the remaining 4 courses with the composure my mother had taught me. The kind that is not absence of feeling but mastery of timing. I spoke when spoken to. I smiled at appropriate moments. I touched Junho's arm once when Director Park made a toast and felt him neither lean into the touch nor pull away from it. That neutrality was its own answer. What the men around that table could not have known, what even Junho could not have known, was that I had spent 3 years learning to be invisible in rooms like this one. And invisible women hear everything. I had heard enough. When the dinner ended, I said my goodbyes with warmth I did not feel, and I rode home in the back of the car beside my husband while Seoul moved past us in cold blue light. He did not speak. He rarely did on the way home from council evenings. His mind was already in his next decision, his next move, the particular mathematics of power that occupied him even when his body was somewhere else. I watched his profile in the dark, sharp jaw, black hair, the stillness of a man who had never once had to be afraid of a room he walked into. He would be afraid soon. He just did not know it yet. That night, around midnight, he came to the bedroom. I was sitting by the window with a book I had not read a word of. He stood in the doorway for a moment, dress shirt open at the collar, gold watch still on his wrist even at this hour. He carried his authority the way other men carry breathing, without deciding to, without stopping. He sat on the edge of the bed. Outside the room, I heard the quiet shift of one of his guards taking a new position in the corridor. They followed him everywhere. Even here in his own home, the machinery of his protection never fully stopped. I kept my eyes on the window. "You were quiet tonight," he said. "I am always quiet at council dinners," I said. Silence. Then, "Are you all right?" I turned to look at him. Up close, in the low lamplight, he was still the man I had chosen, the one who had looked at me 3 years ago, like I was a decision already made and certain of. I had believed that look. "Is there someone else?" I asked. The question landed in the room between us. He was quiet for a long time, long enough for me to understand he was calculating the cost of different answers. This was what Junho did with everything. He measured consequence before he spoke. His whole world ran on the principle that an uncontrolled word was a weapon left on the floor. "No," he said. I held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then I looked back at the window. "All right," I said. He waited. I think he expected more. He was a man accustomed to having every situation respond to his authority. Deals, councils, men who moved entire operations at the sound of his voice. A wife asking one question and accepting one answer should have been the simplest thing he had managed all year. He did not understand that my silence was not acceptance. It was preparation. After a moment he stood, touched my shoulder briefly, and walked to the other side of the room. I sat by the window until his breathing changed. Then I started planning. I called my lawyer at 6 in the morning. Adayeze Okonkwo answered on the second ring the way she always did, as if she had been waiting. "It is time," I said. She did not ask for what. She had kept my father's documents prepared for 3 years, the account structures intact, the notifications ready to file. She had said nothing to anyone. "Everything will be filed by noon," she said. I thanked her and began to pack. My father had built quietly because he understood that the loudest thing in any room is the foundation nobody thinks to examine. Samuel Adeyemi had met Seo Junho's father 26 years ago at a shipping conference in London. 2 men from entirely different worlds who recognized in each other the same understanding, that the structure beneath industries is always more valuable than the industries themselves. They had built the Seo Group foundational trust together, not the visible empire, not the hotels, the security contracts, the logistics networks Junho managed publicly, the structure beneath all of it, the original agreement that made everything else possible. When my father died 4 years ago, his shares passed to me. 44% of everything Junho stood on. I had not known when we married. My father had been ill and I had been grieving, and Adayeze had kept the documents safe, and I had told her I would deal with them later. Later arrived in the middle of a council dinner when I watched my husband's hand move toward a woman he had promised did not exist. I had spent 3 years carrying power I had not opened. This morning I was opening it. Junho found me in the dressing room at 8 with 2 packed bags on the floor. He stood in the doorway, already dressed, dark suit, gold watch. The controlled authority of a man who arranges himself before the world has time to surprise him. He looked at the bags. His expression did not change. That was the specific danger of Junho. Nothing moved on his face unless he decided it should. "Nadia, I am leaving," I said. Even, not cold. Finished. Where are you going? Away from here. He stepped into the room. We should discuss last night. We discussed last night. You told me there was no one else. He moved toward the bag. I placed my hand on it before his arrived. Just my hand, flat and calm. Not fighting, not grabbing. Simply making clear that the next decision about this bag and everything in it belonged to me and not to him. He stopped. His hand was 3 inches from mine, and he stopped completely. In 3 years, I had never reached for anything in his world before he offered it. I had adjusted myself to the edges of his rooms and his decisions and his silences and called it love. I watched something shift in his expression. Not anger, something more disorienting. He was a man confronting the possibility that something he had assumed was his had just made a decision without him. Men like Junho were not often surprised. When they were surprised, it looked exactly like this. Not loud, not explosive, just a brief failure of the machinery behind the eyes. You cannot simply leave, he said. I know, I said quietly. That is why it took me 3 years. I picked up both bags. At the door, I turned once. Your father's name is in my father's documents, I said. Ask Director Park to explain what that means before your 10 o'clock. Then I walked out. What would you have done? 3 years. Would you have left sooner or stayed until you were certain? Tell me in the comments, because the answer I gave myself that morning changed everything that came after. I learned what happened in the boardroom from Adayez that afternoon. Junho had called the emergency council meeting at 9:15. All 12 members assembled. He stood at the head of the table, 7 years of unquestioned authority behind him, and told them there had been a filing error with the foundational trust that would be resolved shortly. Director Park had placed a document on the table, my father's original agreement. Samuel Adeyemi's signature beside Seo Byung-ho's signature, 44%. The agreement that had existed 6 years before Junho inherited anything. There is no filing error, Director Park said. Ms. Adeyemi is the senior trust holder. She has been since her father's passing. Junho looked around the table. Director Park stood up. The man beside him stood, then 3 at once. Then the rest. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way men who have spent their careers reading power stand when they understand where it has moved. By the time the last chair pushed back, Junho was the only person seated in his own boardroom. Every man had followed me out, not because of sentiment, because 44% of the foundation meant the ground beneath the empire bore my name, and powerful men do not stand on ground without knowing whose name it carries. He came to Adayez's office at 2 in the afternoon. I know this because I was already inside the conference room with Director Park and 3 members of the Foundational Council when his car pulled up outside. Adayez's assistant told me. Junho walked through the lobby with 2 of his men, the same bodyguards who had stood outside the dining room at the Grand Elysian the night before. The lobby staff moved aside for him automatically, the way they always did, the way everyone always had. The receptionist told him Miss Okonkwo was unavailable. He told her to tell Ms. Okonkwo that Seo Junho was here. The receptionist relayed the message. Adayez's assistant returned and told him that Ms. Okonkwo was in a meeting with the senior trust holder and her counsel and could not be interrupted. He asked who the senior trust holder was. There was a pause. The assistant told him. Through the conference room glass, I could not see his face, but I saw his bodyguard take a half step forward and then stop. The specific pause of a man trained to respond to his employer's cues, finding no cue to respond to. Junho was not moving, not speaking, just standing in the lobby of a building he had passed 100 times, understanding for the first time that it had a door he did not have permission to walk through. After a long moment, he turned and walked back out to his car. He did not send his men in first. He did not raise his voice. He just left. That was the moment I understood the true nature of his power. It had never been his. It had been the room's agreement that it was his. And when the room withdrew that agreement, quietly, legally, with documents my father had signed 26 years ago. There was nothing underneath it. He had spent 7 years building an empire on inherited ground and calling it his own. The day I stopped crying was the day he found out whose ground it actually was. He called at 4 o'clock. I did not answer. At 4:30, at 5, at 6:15, at 7 a message arrived. Not from him, from Ha Yun. I did not know he was married. He told me you were separated. I held the phone for a moment, then I placed it in my bag and ordered food from the small restaurant near Adayase's office, where I used to eat with my father when I visited him in Seoul. The food was exactly as I remembered, warm and particular and mine. I ate alone and I did not cry. I had done all my crying already. 3 years of it, in rooms he never entered and at hours he never kept. I had cried for the man I believed he was, and the marriage I believed we were building, and the future I had been patient enough to stay for. The day I stopped crying was the morning I packed those bags. And when I stopped, and finally, completely stopped, there was nothing left in me that his empire could use. That is the thing about grief when you let it finish. It does not make you weak. It empties you of everything that was never truly yours. What remains is only what was always there. My name. My father's name. The ground beneath what he thought he owned. The day I stopped crying, his empire started falling. Not because I destroyed it, because I stopped holding it together. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever given years of yourself to someone who did not understand what they were being given, subscribe right now. Drop your city or your country below. Tell me the moment you knew she was always the one holding it together. This channel exists for every woman who cried alone, stayed longer than she should have, and discovered that walking out was the most powerful thing she ever did. More stories are coming. Stay with me.